All right, well, welcome to our staff panel discussion. We are very, very happy to have Tommy Reynolds with us today from Congressman Buddy Carter's office from Georgia, and Rebecca Rodriguez from Congressman John Curtis's office. And give them a big round of applause and big welcome. As people come in, but I think we can go ahead and get started. One thing just to start off, there are note cards for questions. If you could fill those out and hold them up when you have a question and somebody will come around to collect it. And just as a note, this panel is not about policy. It's not about politics. It's about a day in the life of a staffer, what they're working on, like the pressures, like what's happening, what does a day look like for them. And so like we're not doing specific questions about particular kinds of legislation or their boss's viewpoints on climate or any other viewpoint. It's like what's a day look like for them. And so like focus your questions there if you have them, and we will get to those at the end. But I'll start off, Rebecca and Tommy, if you guys just want to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about how you came to be congressional staff.
You want to start?
Sure. So I'm Rebecca. I work for Congressman John Curtis from Utah. I've been with the congressman for about 3 years now. And I'm also the Deputy Executive Director of the Conservative Climate Caucus, which is a group, I think we're at 76 members now, all Republicans, including Buddy Carter, to really kind of change how Republicans look at climate and climate policy and solutions there. Prior to Congressman Curtis's office, I was at the Department of Agriculture for a little bit under the undersecretary that's over the Forest Service. And then before that was at the Natural Resources Committee on the House side for a year. I'm not from Utah, but I like to claim it because I think that that's the right answer. But I went to Utah State and studied law there. And yeah, thanks for having me.
I'm Tommy Reynolds. I work for Congressman Buddy Carter. How did I start on the Hill? I guess I've been on the Hill 6.5 years now. Ben and I were just talking about how long it's been since I first met him, probably 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah.
I have worked on the Hill my entire career, the whole 6.5 years, all Georgia members. I'm with Congressman Carter now, but before that I was with Congressman Rob Woodall, also from Georgia, and before that, Senator Isaacson from Georgia. I've been a Hill rat the whole time.
Well, that long tenure you both have, that would probably like, this is a good question for you. I mean, the last 2 years, obviously COVID has changed a lot. It's changed how all of us have been working, and especially changed how Congress has been working. And so now we're 2 years in, you want to tell us a little bit about how you feel things have changed since the before times and how things are working now, and give a little bit of perspective on how that's affected your work on a day-to-day basis.
I guess the most obvious is Zoom meetings, right? And the fact that we can have those a whole lot more often than in-person meetings. The Hill's finally opened up for meetings now, so hopefully some of y'all will visit the Hill while you're here. But you'll see there's a process getting in, and that can get a little complicated, especially with all the protocols. But now we have Zoom meetings, which has its flexibilities with benefits, but it also has some challenges for us as staff. Because we can do them whenever, sometimes we get inundated with them. We get, there was one day I remember my boss and I had a Zoom meeting every 15 minutes for I think an hour-and-a-half block. So you have to learn Zoom fatigue is real, and so you have to learn when you should be doing them, when you shouldn't be doing them. But that's definitely the number one thing, and I think that's here to stay. But I definitely and certainly appreciate being able to meet people and see people in person.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think Zoom has changed how we do our job, even within offices. I mean, we had to learn how to work with our team and our boss a lot of times across the country. I mean, my boss didn't come back to DC for a while at the height of COVID. So how do we communicate and still help make good decisions while we're in different time zones and we're meeting, I'm sure you have a similar situation where you're having, I handle climate issues, but I also handle Second Amendment issues, and I handle immigration. So how do I jump from a 20-minute meeting on climate to then now we're going to talk about H-2A visas and that kind of thing? And I think I felt like I lost a little bit of the transition time with Zoom. But I think it's good. Like, I think we've learned to adapt, and kind of shows that we can still do our jobs even when it's not as simple as it had been before.
No, I think that's a real good point for people to realize too. Like, staff are pulled in different directions. They work on a lot of different issues, and that's why, you know, climate in particular matters the most to us, but there's a lot of other stuff going on. And kind of thinking about the COVID question, what do you think as we inch back to almost something like normal, what do you think is going to stick around from the kind of change that we experienced from COVID? What are those like work rituals and Zoom things that are probably here to stay? But what are the things that you think are really going to like come back and be like the before times?
Definitely, like I said before, definitely think a lot of the meetings will stay, just out of just convenience. The fact that I can talk to a constituent for a meeting whenever we need. It's very convenient and a little bit nicer than just a phone call. There's some things that'll definitely go away. I think some of the hearings we have are hybrid or entirely virtual. We've had these things called committee work weeks, where they've been entirely virtual hearings, more or less. I don't think you'll see that going for into the future as much. But I think just the fact we'll have meetings will continue. I think that, and that's going to be not just a Congress thing. That's going to be in your everyday lives and whatever your day jobs are too, I assume.
I think one thing that I hope goes back, and I think we're starting to see it, is actually being able to leave DC for staff and for members and visit other areas. I was actually just down in Houston doing a clean energy tour out there with my boss, and that's huge. Like, being able to go and have face-to-face conversations and actually see the technology that you're talking about, or have town halls. I know my boss does the like a hiking town hall. That's difficult during COVID, and I think that'll kind of come back. We actually were in Europe earlier this year with our bosses talking about energy, and we couldn't have done that during the height of COVID. So hopefully the actual hands-on stuff and getting out of the Beltway will come back.
Great, yeah, good to get outside the bubble, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
There's apparently a real world out there outside of Washington,
No,
D.C. I don't know what
think
happens
that's a real
there,
thing.
but
I really don't. We're kind of following up on one of the things you brought up earlier, just like the different issues you guys all work on, and this was happening before COVID, but it seems to have accelerated where there seems to be so many different things going on, competing crises. I mean, we want to focus on the climate, and then you have things like the war in Ukraine, and it's always a cascading thing. How are groups most effective to kind of break through that noise or help you process what's going on when they have a specific issue like climate that they care about, and that where you just don't feel overwhelmed by all the other information going on there, and like just talk a little bit about like how much staff bandwidth there is for things. Or is there any more bandwidth is the question.
I think it depends on the office a little bit and how you're structured, but so I can kind of speak from my experience. One of the things that is really helpful for me when I'm meeting with a group, or if my boss is meeting and I'm in that meeting, is there's obviously going to be things that we don't agree on. I mean, I don't think I've ever taken a meeting where I agree with every single thing. And instead of wasting like all of our time arguing about something like that, like let's just get to where we agree and go from there and move up. I think that's the best use of everybody's time. Like you're saying, we're pulled in a lot of different directions, and if we are, our bosses are even more. So just being able to let us be completely present there. We try really hard, even though we do get pulled in a lot of different ways, to be there for that meeting. So just, I think, using all of our time wisely, and that's on us too, to be able to find that common ground.
Yeah, and I would add just having a personal touch almost kind of builds on some of that. You have some understanding that, like she said, she came from a meeting where she was talking about immigration. Now we're talking about climate and energy issues. Sometimes it's going to take a couple of minutes for us to be like, all right, where were we? Where were we on this and this and this? And so having a personal touch, I've been happy to meet with CCL grassroots folks for years now. And to have that personal relationship with some of the advocates that I've met with has been great, and that we can start the meeting, being a little informal is helpful to get our bearings, and then we can dive into the stuff, and then if we need be, hash out some stuff that we don't agree on, or we can, shake hands about the stuff we do agree on.
Yeah.
Well, and this goes to having effective meetings. Like, I mean, what kind of materials do you guys find really helpful that people provide. I know, like, when I was staff, I was terrible. I had like 3 stacks of just like leave behinds that people bring, like there were 30 pages, and they might not have gotten read, I'm going to be honest. So what kind of information that, like, do you guys really want and you are happy to receive, and is not like now making your lives more difficult, honestly, by being just overwhelmed by like material?
PDFs, like in an email, if I can have it on my computer, I think that's the most helpful thing ever. And then just facts about the state. Like, I love Georgia, but sometimes people bring me information about Georgia, and I'm like, I don't know what to do with this. Like, this is not my boss. So, you know, like, and I think actually this group is really good about being specific, but just in general, the targeted, like, it means a lot to us that you went and found out how many people in Utah care about climate, or how many people in Utah want this policy. That actually matters, and that's helpful. The easier that is to access for us makes my life so simple.
Yeah, and when you think about what the end goal is, you're trying to convince whatever member it is to be on board or for whatever it is. So the more you can tailor it and make it easier for the staff to make that pitch to his or her boss, those concise, targeted materials are helpful. If I can go to my boss and say, you know, Georgia's 1st district or the state of Georgia, these are the impacts of whatever the policy is, or whatever the industry is, whatever the more targeted I can make, the better case I can make. It makes it easier for all of us.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, I mean, in circling back around to that, Zoom meetings are probably here to stay. Like, you probably had a lot of Zoom meetings at this point. What do you feel like is a really effective virtual meeting? Like, what are the things that just work in the real world but just don't work on Zoom? Like, that just cause the meeting to be disrupted or just not have a good flow? Like, what would be some advice to peers that will probably be having a lot of like Zoom meetings with members' office just this week and next week?
I find the presentations on there pretty helpful, because even for, not everybody's the most experienced in giving talking their way through a meeting. I know when I first was on the Hill, I struggled to talk through meetings and figure out how to get through it all. And so when you have this kind of natural timeline for things, that's helpful. And even for the people who are there to, especially just everyday constituents, you know, everybody's here to make the best of it. So you have this natural pathway to follow. It makes it a little bit easier.
Yeah, I think just, like you said, the presentations, that's something that at the very beginning of COVID, when people started saying, okay, I'm going to share my screen, I was like, oh my gosh, like, no, don't share your screen. But now I've learned that that's actually really helpful for me, if I can actually see what you're talking about and visualize it, because you don't get to, and we were just talking earlier, you don't get the physical, like, reading the room and reading people's body language and stuff like that. So if I can make up for that with the stats and with like graphics and things like that, that's been helpful for me.
You can reference things there and
Yeah.
ask questions about specific things instead of it being like guessing where everything is.
Yeah.
No, it's helpful. I mean, one of the things, and the answer should not be CCL maybe in this one, but what are some of the things like right now that you see that other NGOs, not us, advocacy groups and stuff that are doing that you really just don't find to be helpful, that doesn't move the conversation forward, that are probably not the most effective ways to advocate for your cause? I always find that to be kind of an interesting little discussion, because I have certain opinions on things that work, and I want to hear your opinions.
Well, to your point about materials that you bring and whatnot, there's definitely groups, none immediately come to mind, but it's definitely happened that say, oh, well, we released this report, this big, multi-page, dozens of page long thing, and it's full of good ideas. Just go take a look at it.
Yeah.
And as we just said, we have problems with bandwidth on the Hill, and so not often I have enough time to sit down and read a few dozen pages on whatever it is. So I don't find that to be helpful. Sometimes they have one-pagers about it, and if it's truly interesting and engaging or relevant to what I need, I can go dive back into it. But again, the human experience is a little bit better, and the fact that I can go to a person and talk about it is, I think, more convincing or more helpful.
Yeah.
I think one thing, and this is difficult, and Congress
You don't have to
is
name
terrible at
names.
it. I won't name names. But I think kind of reading the room on what's going on globally and what's going on in the U.S., there's a group that I'm not going to name names, but they somehow find a way to tie themselves to everything that happens. And I get their emails sometimes. I'm like, this has nothing to do with you. Why are you asking to meet with me on on something else when you know that this is happening and you know that there's a crisis going on. So I think just kind of understanding that and being able to say, okay, like fly-ins they're fly-ins and that's great. But if you're just doing the random reach out and the random check-in, we don't have the bandwidth to be able, in the middle of, a huge gun markup or something like that to shift gears and talk about something in depth. So I think just being able to understand that and understand that we're getting inundated with requests that may or may not have anything to do with anything is helpful.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, and I'll have one last of my questions, and then we'll open it up for your guys' questions. So if you do have questions and you want to get to the back of the room, just raise your hands with the cards, and somebody will be around to get them. But I mean, and the last thing, my 2 cents, so what can we do to make your lives easier? We as an organization, we as engaged, passionate volunteers, love your perspective on that.
I say this in a lot of meetings. It's a little different, I guess, for Rebecca and I, because we do climate and energy stuff. So what y'all advocate for is a little bit more in our wheelhouse. But sometimes there's some other issues that y'all talk about that we're not quite the experts on. So we lean a lot on whatever you bring, and so ensuring that what you're bringing is helpful, is concise, educational, and tailored to our needs. That's the best. Or if you can answer our questions. I remember when I first met with CCL. We had full-on discussions not over just the course of a meeting. We had discussions over months. We had a dialogue going on, and I found that very interesting. I think that it may have been one of the first groups I ever did something like that. And I don't know if that was thanks to y'all or if that was just the initiative.
I'll take all the credit for it.
Or if that was just the initiative of the advocates that were our constituents. But having that dialogue and knowing what's helpful to us is definitely makes our lives easier.
Yeah, I totally agree with the tailoring and just being there and being accessible, although Tom in Utah probably wishes that he was less accessible, just because, we lean, like he's saying, we lean on you guys a lot and we ask for a lot. And so I think the more accessible you are and the more understanding you are that sometimes we don't have the answers and we're looking for you to help us answer it, is huge.
That's great. Well, we can take some questions and just be aware, like it kind of is a booming voice from above. It's kind of a little disconcerting, but you'll get used to it. I'm sure you'll handle it.
I'll start out easy so I don't totally freak you out. So this first question is, what makes a lobby meeting memorable for you?
I think for me, it's probably the personal connection. Like we take a lot of climate meetings, so it would be really easy for all of them to kind of meld together. But I think being able to think back to the personal connection and just talking and the small talk, honestly, makes it huge for me.
Yeah, it's like, what makes anything more memorable than the other thing? The fact that I had a nice conversation about whatever's going on definitely makes one stand out over the other. And that, I think, builds on the ability to have a dialogue over the course of not just a meeting, but going forward. I think that makes it very memorable. And so when Jane Smith calls from CCL, I know we had that wonderful talk and constructive talk, because I know we don't always agree on everything, but the fact that we can have that conversation makes it better.
Great.
Right. Here's a question from online. Hi, thank you so much for sharing your day in the life. When constituents meet with you, how do you relay their concerns to the member of Congress?
I think it probably varies depending on the office. In my office, my boss has an open door policy which he probably regrets sometimes too, where we're able to just walk in and say, hey, I had this meeting. If he had 5 minutes, I can go and sit and talk to him about it. And then if it's something that we want to talk a little bit more in depth, then we do. And in our office, it's very sit down and just discuss the issues. I know some offices do memos and things like that, and we do those for some of the bigger decisions. But for us, it's pretty simple in my office.
Yeah, I would say the same, but also more often than not, for us, if there's a constituent in a meeting, my boss wants to be in there and be in the meeting and know what's going on. And so he gets to hear firsthand what the concerns are. If for whatever reason he can't make it, we'll definitely share it with him. We, same thing, open door policy, especially because my boss is really active and passionate about the climate issues. He wants to hear it all the time, and so always sharing what everybody's views are, especially constituents.
Great. Here's another question. You've done this a bit already, but can you provide perhaps another example of how constituents you've met with have helped you make your job easier and or helped make you more effective?
I'll say one is the ability to get more support, because sometimes you just have a meeting with just one group, but it's just a meeting with one group. But if you can engage other constituents, your neighbors of that congressman or in that district, when we're hearing it from more and more people, we're definitely more apt to act on it and more and going to share with the congressman more or make a move or recommend something. So sharing with your peers, your family members, your neighbors, other constituents, that's definitely another way you can help.
Yeah, I think we're lucky that we have so many universities in our district that we really lean on, and we have a really active student population as well. So we lean on them a lot for research. Methane is a huge issue in the Uinta Basin that we're picking up in Utah, and so we've had hours of meetings with our constituents and professors and just different groups to say, help us explain this. I'm not a scientist, help me understand it. And so in a lot of that, actually, I'm pretty sure we got connected through CCL, but that's just really helpful to have somebody that is boots on the ground in Utah all the time and living this and is able to focus. Because like we were saying, sometimes we can't focus on one issue at all the time, and it's helpful to have people that are. So I hope that helps answer.
Well, and that's one thing I think we've been talking about, that we need to be listening to you guys and what your boss's priorities are and finding out ways that we can be helpful to move those through, whether it's through coalition building, because when we have shared priorities, it shouldn't just be our asking you for help, you can come this direction as well.
Totally.
I would also add, some of these bills can get pretty abstract, that you don't know how does this actually connect to the district. And so anytime you can bring that perspective, because you are the constituent, you can bring that perspective of how this particular bill or whatever action it is, this will benefit the district or constituents. That's also helpful.
Great.
All right, next question. You've mentioned limited bandwidth several times. How would you describe your work-life balance, or more broadly, work-life balance on the Hill? And what would be most helpful in addressing this challenge?
I think it's kind of cyclical. I guess for me, my work-life balance is very cyclical. Sometimes I have a really good balance, and my office works really hard to make sure we do. But the reality is sometimes you're going to be in the office until midnight, and sometimes you're going to have to get there at 5 a.m. And you're going to be there that whole time, and you're going to be working, and you're going to be meeting. But that said, there's times where it's a slower week, and maybe I can leave the office at 4 and go and actually do my dry cleaning for once. That there are some kind of give and take there. But I mean, there's bandwidth issues, like we said, but I think it's possible. I mean, you just kind of have to make some sacrifices, and I think luckily for us, we love our jobs, and so it's easy to make that decision. I don't know how to help that, but maybe more staff or something, I don't know.
Well, I think that might be something to keep in mind when you're meeting with staff, is that these are people who love their jobs, or hopefully love their jobs, because then you are dragged in so many different directions. But we do get to do really cool things. Rebecca and I got to go to Europe in February in the midst. Russia invaded Ukraine while we were in Belgium. We got to experience that. For better or for worse, I guess, on that one. But during when it is very cyclical, in my own relationship with how much I enjoy being swamped or not swamped is cyclical. Because sometimes you're limited and you're working as hard as you can, but you really enjoy what you're doing. but sometimes it drags on you. But Congress works in those kind of waves. You know, right now this summer we're in session. We've been in session last week, this week, and next week.
Yeah.
And then July we'll have another few weeks. But then all of August we're gonna be out of session. So we have an opportunity to cool off a little bit, catch up on a lot of stuff, but also get to go out. I know I plan on going down to our district to meet with folks. I like seeing a lot of stuff firsthand. So it is an interesting balance, but fortunately there are ways to make that balance happen.
Well, and I should bring up one of the things, just that things shift around for you guys. We were supposed to have a third staffer from the House Natural Resources Committee, and everything was good. She was all good to go on Friday, but then found out over the weekend that they're moving a bill to the floor tomorrow, and so that has to take precedence. And I'm sure that happens to you guys all the time.
Yeah, and I think it's always it's nonstop, right? So during the weekend, if something happens, people are wondering what our boss thinks. Even if we don't understand why people are asking us what our boss thinks, people want to know, and we have to be there to have those conversations. And so it's you're always on, even when you're off. But like you said, there's some nice perks to it. I mean, Europe was fun, but it was work, and I think that's unique to this job, is that you don't, even though you're always working, there are the benefits, but it's just a give and take, like I said.
Yeah, it's the intrinsic value of it. We do it because we like it. And so when I remember one time my old boss was on the Rules Committee, and the Rules Committee more often than not meets later in the evening, so it's after everybody else goes home. And at that particular markup they were doing, or not meeting, they were doing the NDAA, which is the National Defense Authorization Act, and we have to pass it every year to authorize all our defense programs. It's a massive, massive bill, usually close to 1,000 pages, and there are usually hundreds of amendments. And so I was at work until I think 1 in the morning doing that stuff, which is not the ideal, but also at the time I was just excited to be a part of this important thing that if that doesn't pass, our national defense programs aren't authorized and we can't defend our country. So it's an interesting balance right there. And then there's certain times, it gets frustrating when Congress doesn't fund itself or fund the country, and it's Christmas and you want to go home. That gets really frustrating.
I think it's worth it when you see something you worked on for a while get signed into law, or you're back in the district and somebody tells you that thank you for doing this. And we get that with the caucus a lot. The blood, sweat, and tears that went into the caucus, it's so worth it to me when I see a member of the caucus say that they want to engage in climate issues. To me, I'm okay, yes, the late nights were hard, but it was totally worth it. And that helps, I think, with burnout and things like that, that would be super possible if you didn't have this kind of end of, oh, I did something.
We have another question from Zoom here. We see a lot of polarization and partisanship in the news. How do you work with staffers from the other side of the aisle? Does this translate into your working relationship with other staffers?
Well, generally it's good. Again, on the human level, everybody. I guess the good news is we're not monsters to each other. We don't hate each other or anything like that. No, we interact all the time and go to. But at least before COVID, and now thankfully things are wrapping up. Now we see each other at functions, happy hours, receptions and whatnot. But when you're making legislation, that one in that venue, you kind of have to pick your battles a little bit more. There's some arenas where you're just not going to agree on things, and so you have to navigate that a little differently. It's also you have to pick. You work with colleagues might have a proclivity to agree with you on certain issues. I know my boss is getting set to introduce a bill pretty soon. Of course, we wanted to be bipartisan, have more of a chance to move forward. And so we've naturally just looked for people who would be more of our allies, not going to someone we deliberately know would not agree with us. And so I think most importantly though is we're all human. We're all Hill staffers. We all go through the same things.
Totally. I think there's a sense of kind of camaraderie, even if I'm sure that there's a staffer that we would never agree on anything. but we can agree on just kind of like the work-life balance of the Hill and what that means and how that affects everything. So I think that at the staffer level, for the most part, things are good and we get each other. I will say, kind of going back to Zoom and COVID, I think that's one of the negatives that's come out of Zoom is so much of our job happens on the phone and in the hallways, and just who do you know and who do you meet and how do you have that relationship with people on the other side of the aisle, and how do your bosses have that relationship? And I think that that's something that really is sad that we're losing with virtual, is the members don't have that interaction as much anymore, and staff don't have that interaction. It's a lot easier, I think, to go into your hole of, okay, well, I know these 5 people, when you can do it on Zoom. But I think the polarization doesn't exist as much on the staff level. Yeah. And I actually truly don't think it exists that much on most of the member level. It's just not as fun to talk about in the news if everything's just going well.
No, absolutely. I always remember those instances, like when the senator would get on the elevator. It didn't matter who was in the elevator, Democrats, Republicans, and they'd all just start joking around with each other and like backslapping and things. And people don't get to see that. Yeah. That is definitely like behind the curtain.
All right, another question here, just more of a procedural question. How do staffers become connected to their member of Congress, or how do you learn to accurately represent your boss's positions?
That's a good question. A lot of it is getting to know your boss, which I've heard stories of staffers who don't know their boss very well, and they've had that challenge where they're trying to represent their boss's views, but they haven't had as much time to actually interact with their boss and get to know what they want, what they like, what they agree on. So I know I'm fortunate. I talk to my boss nearly every day. Sometimes more than I'd like to, but I interact with him and get to joke around with him and I know where his head's at on things. So, but I started with my boss now the very first week COVID hit, when we shut down, and so I went to the office and I was given a laptop and a new work phone and said, "We'll see you when you see you." And so it made it a little more difficult, but fortunately for me personally, because I worked in the Georgia delegation, I at least knew a lot of the background behind it. I knew the staff already. So I had that personal bit, but definitely getting to know your member on a human level is definitely helpful.
Yeah, I think it can be difficult if staff don't remember that the members of Congress are human too. Like they're not this like celebrity almost. Like I think some staff, especially at like interns and things like that, sometimes are afraid to talk to the member because they're so cool or something. And I'm like, they're just people. And my boss especially has made an effort to get to know us on a personal level. He wants to know like about our family. Every week that I see him, he asks how my mom and my brother are doing. And so I think it's a two-way street. I actually got connected with my boss. So when I was on the Natural Resources Committee, probably everyone in Utah is going to go as soon as I say this, but my second day of my internship on the Natural Resources Committee was a hearing about Bears Ears. And I met John Curtis then, and I remember going home just so impressed with him, just how he spoke, everything. And we worked really closely with his office, and that's how I got connected with them. Is when I was at USDA, they called and said, "Hey, we have an opening, and we know that you're like weirdly obsessed with John Curtis. Do you want to come work for him?" And I was like, "Yeah, of course." And I think a lot of it is just who do you know? Like he said, he knew the people in the office already. I knew someone in the office, and I had worked in the Utah delegation before. I understand Utah. I think there's a lot on the staff to be able to understand the state and just get to know the district. I mean, the district staff even, like they help us so much try to grasp how a certain decision is going to play out back home. And I think we have to really kind of lean on them and our boss to help us when we have to make decisions like that.
All right, here's a logistical question for our volunteers who are going to have lobby meetings this week. What are the current protocols for in-person meetings? What do we need to do to get into the congressional office at this moment in time?
think it just call the office that you're meeting with when you get to the entrance, and then they will send somebody down, or should send somebody down to get you in through security.
Yeah, I think you just need to be escorted.
Yeah.
Unless I've been doing it wrong this past couple weeks.
Yeah, unless somebody yells at you for doing that, then we didn't tell you that.
Yeah, if you have a staffer escort you in, I'm pretty sure you have free reign once you come in.
Yeah.
But they want to make sure, I think, the staff are escorting the people in at least.
And just a note for that logistical thing, the House protocols are different than the Senate protocols. And so that is just for the House side. Senate side, they instituted something new starting last week where you do have to sign in, get a badge, and you do not have free reign of the building. You have to be escorted out. So just FYI.
So just to follow up on that, on the House side, should our volunteers expect that the cafeterias are open, or are those closed?
Yes,
They're open.
They're open. All of them are open right now.
And expanded. They have new options now.
And
really?
in the subway on the ground floor of Rayburn, they have soft served ice cream. And I'm normally there, so I'll see you there.
I like that got the more response than anything else. Like everybody's
It's really
excited.
good.
Awesome.
All right, we've gotten several questions in this vein, but I'll ask this one. When we contact your offices, are all forms of contact equal? For example, calls or personal emails or foreign emails. What are your thoughts on that?
I'd say no, but it also depends on the office.
Yeah.
You know, again, if you reach out to me personally, like I've met with you, that's going to hold a whole lot more weight than just if you called into our front office, that we don't have a front office, just an office. But if you called into the office and said, hey, please vote for X, Y, Z, or support X, Y, and Z, or whatever. That's nice, and you should, and I don't want to discourage anybody from doing that, but if you had a meeting with me and I give you my business card and you send me an email saying, or call for me and talk with me, that's going to carry a lot more weight.
Totally. I think personal emails, even if you're going on the website and doing it through that, those go a lot further than the form ones. Because we probably get about 1,000 pieces of mail a day. And that's a lot to go through, and a lot of them, if they are all the same thing, then yeah, it makes it easier on our legislative correspondent who's like batching them and things like that, but it's a little less personal. So I think anything personal like that we can, at least in our office, what we do is it'll get sent to the legislative assistant that handles that, and sometimes it's elevated to the boss level, depending on what it is, and that kind of thing. So I think as personal as you can get, the better, but also utilize us. Like, I sometimes will see a letter come through and I'm like, they have my email, they have my cell phone, why don't they just call me? It's a lot faster that way. And we also are happy to, or at least I think this is pretty universal, we're always happy to explain why something happened, right? Why we voted against something or why we voted for something. And it's easier to respond, it's just to us.
Oh, well, a little follow-up on that, like two things. I'm always curious on this as things develop, like, how closely do you guys monitor social media when it comes to things that are happening? I know some offices have like a monitor up where it's like if there's a tweet that's like coming up and people know about it, and some offices, they pay no attention whatsoever to if people are tweeting at their boss. Do you guys have any perspective on that for your guys'?
I'm curious about what office that
I
is.
know.
I'm trying to remember now in my brain when I walked, I was like, holy moly.
I have
like,
some
they just,
ideas
like,
on who it might
scrolling
be,
all over
but
Twitter.
I think it does depend. I more watch things for my issue areas, right? It's like I try to look at what anybody's tweeting about climate stuff. We do have a communications director that's part of his job is to kind of monitor it. I will say, as soon as somebody puts something super negative up, and I mean, it happens all the time, like this is normal, that immediately to us, like we're not gonna take that seriously. And it'd be the same if we commented something like that, if we were aggressive. I think we saw this a lot in the former administration of people asking us, like, why aren't you responding to this tweet? And I think my boss's statement was something like, if I was gonna respond to every tweet that he had, I would have no time to do anything else. And so for us, it's more of it's helpful to see what people are saying, but also we know that the loud people generally aren't the majority. So we take it into consideration, but I think not as much as the male.
Yeah, I mean, I think I use it mostly to just be caught up to date with what's going on, honestly. There's always negative comments. I don't think I really read comments anymore, honestly. For my boss's social media, though, you gauge, you kind of see what the temperature is on things. There's also the aspect of us using it as a tool to be able to talk about what we want to talk about for our offices. So when we're pushing out a bill or something, we want to make sure people know about it, or we're talking about something important, or why we're voting against something, or why we're pushing against something. It's helpful in that way as well.
Yeah.
Here's another question from some of our volunteers tuning in via Zoom. Could we hear more about the Conservative Climate Caucus, such as how we might help it along?
Okay, you have to give me a time limit and tell me to stop. So my boss started the Conservative Climate Caucus back last June. In fact, we're probably coming up right on a year. And the whole goal of it is to educate Republicans on climate issues and how that relates to pretty much everything. It's difficult to talk about climate without talking about national security, and it's difficult to talk about climate without talking about health. They obviously all have this intersection, and I'm preaching to the choir here. But I think there was a hesitancy for some Republicans to engage in it. And I think a lot of that comes from the connotation of, if you talk about climate, then you automatically agree with the Green New Deal. And that's not true. There's a way to care about climate and find climate solutions that also fit conservative principles. And that was really the goal, is how do we get members and staff engaged on this? And it was kind of twofold. There were some members that wanted to engage, and their staff was saying, look, this isn't a safe space for you. There's some staff that really wanted their member to engage, and the member was nervous. So now, when we launched last year, when I left the office that night before, we had 35 members, and I was ecstatic. I thought we were going to have like 10, because I'm kind of pessimistic when it comes to things like that. And when I got to work the next day, we had 60 members for launching. We're now the second largest Republican caucus in Congress. And we've been doing like 101s. Literally, that's what I call our briefings, our 101s. Nuclear 101, fuels 101. When somebody says gas and natural, like gasoline and natural gas, do you know the difference of that? And how do we start at this basic level and make people feel comfortable? So we do member briefings and staff briefings. We've had a couple member trips. In fact, we keep talking about Europe. That was the EU reached out to the caucus and said, we want to bring you in to talk to our vice president and our energy secretaries. We want to engage. I think even they recognize that anything to happen in the US when it comes to climate and energy is going to have a bipartisan backing. And so it's huge that these members are engaging. And I think the biggest way that groups like CCL can help with that is, one, acknowledge how difficult it might have been for that member. We have members that come to our events that their names are not on the caucus because they're still nervous about the word climate. But they come to all of our events, and to me, I'm like, okay, I don't care, that's fine, I want you to just get the information. So just kind of meet members where they're at. They might not be outspoken on it, but them or their staff. I mean, we normally have 50 staff at all of our briefings. We normally get about 20 members at our events. That's really difficult to do with schedules. So I think just meet them where they're at. Thank them for joining the caucus if they have, and if they haven't, tell them to contact me or my boss. And my boss is always happy to talk them through it. And just instead of saying okay, well, what's next? I think some of these members are still at the thank you for even engaging. And yeah, our goal is to eventually get to the what's next, but I think some of our members are still a little hesitant, which I'm more than happy with as long as they're talking about it.
Well, not to go too much down the rabbit hole, because I don't want to put you guys on the spot on these things, but I know this question will come up since we got on the caucus a little bit. Do you want people asking their members of Congress to join, or do you kind of want it to be a small enough when that's not a small group anymore, but kind of stay as it is so people have a little bit of time to learn the issues before it just continues to grow?
Of course, we want more people to join. I mean, please ask your members to join. The only downside to that is I have to go meet with all these members at some point, and I only have so much time, so it's a me problem. But
so think about Rebecca when you make that ask.
Yeah, think about me. No, no, we want more people to join. Even if they don't want to join and they want to be on our mailing list, you're welcome to send their staff to me. I've probably bugged their staff about it before, so they know who I am. But, like I said, any way to just being welcomed. CCL had a huge piece of my boss finally feeling comfortable to talk about this stuff because he knew he had the backing back home. It's so much easier to go out on a limb, which to some of these members, it feels like that when you have a landing pad, and I think CCL is really good at that. And so that would be my ask to you guys is when you're talking to some of the members of the caucus and not the caucus, just meeting them where they're at and finding that common ground. Right now, energy security is a huge piece. Coming in and talking to them about how readying ourselves for climate and climate adaptation pairs with national security and energy security. I think looking at Ukraine and Russia, that's a huge, they like that. They know what you're talking about there. You'll get a lot further there.
Great, thank you. And here's another question with a request for guidance. When should we meet with our senator or representative in DC versus when is it more appropriate to meet with them in their home state or local office?
Well, the most obvious is when they're in DC and when they're in the state. When we're in session, they're going to be in DC, and that's going to be, or their days are filled with not just meetings, but hearings and votes and whatnot. So finding your way into that time period, it can be challenging, but I know every member I've ever interacted with makes an effort and wants to meet with their constituents in DC. And then when they're not there, when we're out of session, I know my boss makes his schedule as full as possible, so he's busy. I think he's even busier when he's down in the district. So try and find time then. I don't know how other members handle it. Some, handle their schedules differently. So, but that's the, looking at the House schedule, which I know is not the clearest thing, and sometimes it changes. But when the House is in, when the Senate is in, and sometimes one's in and the other's not. So I think you probably should lean on guys like Ben for that.
Yeah.
A little bit. Well, I mean, it's a good thing too. Like, and you might have a response to Rebecca, but maybe a little bit background on the difference between district staff and DC staff, because I think that also can trip people up a little bit. So if you want to give a little perspective on that.
Yeah, well, what I was going to say is I think anytime you're doing an event in the state and you want him to come to something, or somebody's getting an award and you think you might be interested, like invite your member to everything. They might only be able to go to one thing, but invite them. And I think the more they're hearing from you, the better it's going to be and easier. I was also going to say, I'm glad you brought up district staff, because we have a district director who's amazing, and anything that he can't go to, she's there. And I think that's a big piece of district staff. Like what they do is they represent him or represent the congressman in the district, and are able to. They're usually from there. They get it a little bit better. They know people. And a lot of district staff, they help with casework and things like that. So if you're ever having an issue with an agency, in fact, my mother seems to think that I am her district staffer, and I keep trying to remind her that if she wants a passport done, she needs to call her congressman. But that's okay. So they are a little bit more boots on the ground of day to day in our case, Utah. And then we, in the DC office, do policy. So we're looking at through the bills with the lens of how does this affect Utah, but we really rely on them to tell us, like, no, here's what I'm hearing at the grocery store. This is what people are talking about. That's probably similar.
You nailed it on the head. That's exactly how our district staff is, and I suspect for all of them, it's their almost like the community's connection to the office.
Yeah.
Our field reps are at every event that they can possibly be at, with our boss or without them. And again, just being the ear to the ground.
Totally.
Here's another question from our listeners on Zoom, more of a personal interest question. What kinds of jobs do staffers aspire to after having gained experience as a congressional staffer?
Not public office. No, I'm just kidding.
So you guys all want to come work for CCL, right?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of opportunities, and I think it's kind of what you want to do, right? Like I've found this niche where I really enjoy climate and clean energy and trying to come at it from a conservative perspective. So I think if I were looking for something, I'd look at ways that I can build upon what I've already, what I've built and what I've worked hard on and the policy side of things. I mean, there's administration jobs, there's a lot out there.
There are infinite possibilities, and I think my problem with it is the reason I love my job so much is that I get exposed to so many different things. If you love learning, this is a job for you because you're going to be exposed to everything. But that also makes it a challenge of I have no idea what I'll do next.
I don't know what I want to do when I grow up.
Yeah, you could be administration if the timing works out, if the administration's on your side of the aisle. There's trade groups, there's nonprofits, there's companies. You could be a lobbyist, I guess. There's so many different things you can do. You can go back to where you're from and do stuff there.
So some people leave the Beltway completely, and
I know,
they don't.
yeah,
I'm like, there's a world out there.
I don't know what that is.
I don't know what
Sucked in
happens
20
in the real
years ago,
world.
and I haven't left yet, so I don't know. I don't know who makes those decisions.
I joke about not wanting to run for public office, but there are some members that used to be staffers. Garrett Graves from Louisiana comes to mind. And you can always tell the members that used to be staff because they never really let go of doing everything. And you're like, okay.
Well, Tommy, your old boss was a former staff, wasn't he?
Yep,
Yeah.
he was. Yeah, he. I remember I was constantly asking him for advice because he started as a legislative correspondent, which is an LC, I guess, in short terms, on the Hill. And he worked his way up, and he was eventually chief of staff for a member who retired, and he just threw his head in the ring to become the member eventually. And he definitely had a different perspective, and it is interesting working for a member who was a staffer and now working for a member who was not a staffer. It was rewarding on one side because I learned so much from him, because learned how to be a good staffer, and he had a wealth of knowledge. He just knew practically everything. The institutional knowledge alone, just from how many decades he was on the Hill. But it's now cool to be on the other side of now having a boss where I can be that. I can be more valuable. Because at that point, it was like, well, do you need me here?
This is another question on the other side of that. And this is one of our younger attendees who dropped off this question. You've already shared how you got your positions, but what are some common pathways that some of your other colleagues follow to get a job on the Hill?
That's probably my favorite thing about the Hill, is that there are infinite number of pathways to get there. One of the first things you do, I think, when you're on the Hill is you start getting informational interviews, or you get coffee interviews with folks, just to learn, A, to just build your networks and just to know a lot of people, but B, to learn what the different paths everybody took to get to where they are. I've known people who are genuine scientists, and had a degree in bioengineering, and just decided, you know what, I want to be a Hill staffer now. Or a lot. I guess the traditional path is you graduate college, you probably have an internship on the Hill right after that, and that turns into a job. But there are infinite number of ways of getting exposed to it. And then they're not just jobs like ours. I think we took a more traditional route, out of school, find our way on there. But there are other jobs on the Hill. There's committee staff. Those committee staffers are typically more expert in their area, and so they, a lot of times, have worked in the industry that their committee focuses on, or something like that, or have advanced degrees in those areas. So there's a whole host of different things that you can do.
Yeah, I think to first start out, interning is so important. Not just because it helps you learn how the Hill works, but also if you actually really like it. I've seen a lot of people that they skip the intern part and they come in and now there's a lot on their shoulders, and it's not for everybody. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I think the internships where you're watching everybody else and you're watching how crazy it can get and how they utilize their time is huge. And then kind of like Tommy was saying with networking, who do you know? A lot of the Hill is, to be able to do your job well, you have to know the right people, and you have to know who to talk to. For one thing, I'm not going to call the Natural Resources Committee if I have a question about immigration. I'm going to call the guy over there. Just kind of that knowledge of who's the best out there, and talking to everybody in your office and outside of it. If there's somebody or there's an office you really like, or a committee that you're really interested in, cold email them and ask them for coffee. you know, it might take a few weeks to be able to schedule it, but generally everybody, staffers on the Hill, we get it, we've been there, and we want to be helpful. So I think that would be my advice, is utilize us.
We're in the last 5 minutes here, so you've already answered so many questions, but we're getting near the end here. Here's one maybe you can have a little fun with. You've answered some version of this, but here's a different phrasing. What is your least favorite way to be approached by constituents? Do you have any pet peeves?
Oh, I have one. I don't understand how this happens, but for some reason, there's a couple groups that they'll send these form emails, but they send them to our emails. And so instead of going through the process, and they're not personalized at all. So I woke up one day and I had 400 emails just from random people, and they all said the same thing. And I'm like, okay, well,
To your direct email.
yeah, to my direct email. And I was like, do I respond to everybody? You know, what do I do? Because then that makes it really difficult. I want to be responsive, but these all say the same thing, and nothing's personalized. In fact, my name's spelled wrong in all of them. And so that's my least favorite way to be approached, is 400 times, all with the same thing, and no anything in there.
Mine personally, I think, is calling when I'm busy, which is, you know, a lot of the time, and no one can help that. But when I get a call and you intend to discuss this right now, I think that can be difficult, you know, because of course I want to talk to you and I want to talk about whatever it is, but let's find a time to do that, and so it's also the best use of your time as well, because if I'm not prepared for it, then you're just there talking to me, and I'm just trying to figure out what's going on.
Well, I think that's probably a good place to end. I mean, we have two great examples of Hill staffers. We really appreciate Tommy and Rebecca, and you can see all the hard work they do. And so really when you are working on your advocacy and talking to staff, like, these are good examples of, you know, the people we work with, and they work really hard. They want to be engaged and they want to be helpful, but they got a lot going on. There's no doubt that they have a lot going on, and I think that's something to really keep in mind when you're planning your meetings and doing your outreach. And we're lucky to have dedicated staff like this to work with in Congress. So if we could give them a big round of applause. Really appreciate you guys. And I will say, like, they've been very generous with their time today, and they probably need to get back to their real jobs now. And so, like, I'll probably hold any questions you have and let them get out the door. Don't mob them like rock stars, please.
Oh, well, I mean, if you have to. It's okay.
I mean, that's the biggest applause I've ever gotten.
I know, I'm gonna go back and tell my boss that now when I walk into a room, I want the applause.
Yeah, absolutely.